As the name would suggest, Finishing Touch Carpentry is a finishing company, and primarily that's what we do, is build stairs and railings and do finishing. But I began my trade when I was 17 years old, and I got my start doing framing, and every now and then I'll take on a framing job. Here we're building a really nice little garden shed for a customer that we've worked for in the past, and it's a really good opportunity for me to show you some basic framing, little tricks and things that you need to know so that you can make your own small structure. I'll explain a little bit about wall construction. Primarily you're going to have a bottom plate, a top plate, and then a second top plate that is going to tie the walls together. On the end wall, it will be 7 inches smaller than your overall dimension, because each wall is 3.5 inches wide. Your top plate is going to be the full length, so it's going to overlap the corners, and I'll show you a picture of that, what that looks like. On the end walls, you're going to have a corner stud, and the top plate is going to be back 3.5 inches, and that's how you create the overlap. The studding is done in 16-inch centers, and I'm going to show you how you can lay out the centers so where there's a joint in the sheets, the plywood will land on a stud. Here we have 2 wall plates that are 12 feet long. This is a 12-foot long wall. I'm going to lay these out on 16-inch centers. Now what a lot of people don't realize is you have to go 3/4 back, and you'll see in a minute why you go 3/4 back. That's so if you lay a 4-foot sheet of plywood, it's going to come right here on the center of the stud. If you just simply mark out 16-inch centers in an X, your sheet will come on the edge of the stud. One of the things I do when I'm framing is I position the studs so the hump is up, or the crown on the stud is up, and so they're all the same, and they'll have less inconsistencies when you go to sheet your walls. As you can see here, that 8-foot sheet came right on the center of a stud. Then I'm going to add a 4-foot piece to make up the 12. One of the things that is sort of a rule of thumb with sheeting is plywood goes horizontal, OSB or chipboard goes vertical. You may have noticed that I trimmed the top edge of that plywood. That's because this is a non-typical wall height as called for in the plans. But normally, if you use a 92 5/8 stud length 2x4, you'll end up with a wall that is a standard 8'1" wall height. So what we're framing here is a simple 12 by 8-foot building. I've got 2 walls that are laid out to be exactly 12 feet long with a corner stud on each end. The 2 8-foot walls that go in between the 3.5-inch walls on each side is going to be 7 inches shorter than 8 feet. So what I'm doing when I lay out my studs now, because the sheeting needs to hang over 3.5 inches to cover the corner wall, I'm simply putting a chunk of 2x4 here, laying my tape measure on it, and doing the same 16-inch centers again, marking 3/4 of an inch back. Now I've got 3.5 inches there at that end, so I'm going to make my mark 3.5 inches back on this end, and that's where I'm going to cut my plate. Because this shed will be sitting on outdoor pavers, I'm using a treated bottom plate to prevent rot. So what I'm going to demonstrate here is if this is an end wall with your 3.5 inch overlap, you lay the sheet on here, make sure it's flush on the plate. You start at the corner and you put that 2x4 in place and then just knock that plywood over until it's flush. All right, it's flush now. Now I'm going to put my first screw in. Now, just one comment is if this was a corner wall or a wall with a corner stud, this plywood would be flush on the end of the plate. But because this is an overlap, we start with that 2x4. Now what I'm going to do, it's important that you work from the corner along the bottom plate. As you go, you straighten out that bottom plate. Now I'm going to use my the same 2x4 I did at the end here to straighten out the end stud. So once my wall is completely sheeted and I've drawn my lines, I'm going to shoot some 2-inch staples in with a pneumatic stapler. If you don't have that kind of equipment, just use a coated nail with a head on it and put your nails about every 8 inches into your studding along the lines. You'll see here that I also lay out the centers along the top edge of the plywood. That ensures that my studs are relatively straight. The other thing I do is square up the wall by using my tape measure and doing a corner-to-corner measurement, ensuring they're the same. So whenever you do framing, you have to be conscious of load, and that is a principle that's all through construction. On the walls that support the rafters, that's where all the load is on the building. So when you frame your windows and doors, they have to be framed in such a way that it's not just a screw holding the supporting member in place. It has to be actual lumber that bears the load. So the way we do windows and doors is that if the rough opening, and in this case is 62.5, the header is actually made 3 inches longer because there's a short stud on each end that picks up the load. Now when we get down to the bottom of the doorway, this is something specific to doors, is I always make a little cut on the bottom of the plate because later on this will be cut off with a handsaw, and that way you're not going to damage your saw by marking the floor. In order to lay out the front door, I'm finding the center of the wall, and because the opening is 62.5, I'm measuring 31.25 on each side of the center mark and marking the edge of my rough opening. Okay, now because you have an opening that's bigger than your standard 16-inch centers, above a window you make a thing called a header, which is pieces of lumber that are on edge and they're doubled up or sometimes even tripled up. In this case, it's not a house, it's a small shed, so 2 2x6s is going to be sufficient to take the load. When you frame a window, these side pieces right here are going to be cut exactly the height of the rough opening. This shape here is the rough opening here and here, these two dimensions. Your window will be 1 inch smaller each way than your rough opening. So you can either order your windows to a specific size and make your rough opening an inch bigger on each dimension, or do it the other way around, build your rough opening and then order the windows special made. So in this case, this is a little more complicated situation because there's so many windows. I did one big long header. But normally, if you're just going to have a window in a shed, you'd have a long stud going all the way up here. The header would end underneath this short support here. And also you're going to continue 16-inch centers above and below the windows to again pick up the load. If I simply put a header between two 2x4s with no support underneath, you'd in effect be carrying the load with the strength of a screw or a nail, which is not proper under the building code. Now, if you just look up here at the door opening, I know I just explained to you that there's no load on the end wall, only on the side walls, but just as a matter of construction practice, we make a header above the doorway even though it's in the gable end wall that technically doesn't bear any load. When you make up your headers, you're simply going to add 3 inches onto the length of the rough opening, cut 2 2x6s, and then screw them together, 2 screws every 16 inches or so. When you make up a wall section with windows, it's best to screw the headers onto the long studs before you do any other studs on either side of the window. So I'm going to show you how you make a corner stud. This is what a corner stud is going to look like when you're doing your layout. The sheeting is going to go on top of here, and this part of the corner stud, or the L part, will be facing the inside. So you pick 2 fairly straight studs, and you use a 3rd stud as a support, and I'm just going to screw these 2 studs together. And you're going to work from one end to the other and straighten out the corner stud as you go. Corner studs built this way are going to allow you to get insulation in behind that corner, but also provide a nailer for inside paneling. Well, everything looks like it's going well here, but I'll let you in on a secret. We're actually framing that wall upside down. The windows should be facing the garden, not the driveway. This is a very common mistake made in framing, and it's really no excuse for me doing this as I'm building it on the spot. I didn't catch this until the wall was partially sheeted, and with the help of my brother-in-law, a very strong guy, we spun this wall around, and because the wall was symmetrical, it worked out. So just a couple words on window placement. Windows in a blueprint are normally marked on the center of the window from the edge of the wall or the outside wall. So that's how you lay them out. You find the center of the window and then do your rough opening on each side of that center. The other thing you want to lay out properly, and especially if you're building something like a shed with a steep overhang or a steep roof, you want to make sure that your window is placed such that the eaves don't block your view through the window. So in other words, if you put the window right at the very top of this opening, the 16-inch overhang would actually block the window. The other thing you want to do is think about placement of the window so it's comfortable for you to see out the window, not too low, not too high. And that's something that you could even lay out on either a scale diagram or lay some sheets of plywood down on your driveway and put rafters on there and actually see, so you can have an idea what it's going to look like when it's all framed up. So here's the wall after we spun it around. I didn't get any footage of that process because I didn't have an extra hand with me, but If this wall had not been symmetrical, for example, a door and a window in the wall, you'd have to actually tear the sheeting off and reverse the corner studs in order to repair that problem. So just keep that in mind when you're framing. You'll notice I've been using my track saw throughout this build for cutting plywood. It's not something that's necessary, but if you already own a track saw, it's a real quick way to cut sheets in half and trim sheets. It's actually quicker than measuring and snapping a line and cutting freehand. When you put your second row of plywood in, that's when you'll see whether the wall is square. If it is, they'll fit like pieces of a puzzle. Another thing I do is I sheet right over the windows and then use a router to route out the openings. You obviously have to mark where your windows are, but it works really slick. So what I've got in my router is a pilot bit which drills its own hole, or you can use a template bit as shown on the right here. Just have to drill a hole before you start. When you're routing the windows, go in a clockwise direction, and that way the bit will ride along the side of the stud. I recommend using some kind of straight edge to mark where your studs are, and that gives you a nice neat job, less nails or staples sticking through the plywood on the inside. And finally, I staple all the rows down every 8 inches with a Boss Stitch crown stapler, 2-inch staples, or you can just use a nail as I've mentioned before. As you can imagine, this 12-foot wall is pretty heavy with all these windows and framing members and 5/8 plywood on the outside, hence all the grunting you hear in the background. And when you stand the walls up and screw them together, it's one of the most satisfying things in carpentry. This will be the first in a series of videos on how to build a shed. We're going to start with the framing video, and my intent is to bring several different segments of this process right to the finishing and show you how with some skills you could build your own shed. I'm going to show you how to screw up a video. Thanks for watching this video. If you have any questions on framing, leave them in the comments section below and I'll be sure and answer them. And don't forget to like and subscribe so I can continue doing more videos like this. And a special thank you to my helper Alden Conrad for his excellent work and filming skills.